This is the story of Gehazi, assistant to the prophet Elisha, servant of the man who parted waters and raised the dead. Gehazi carried the staff of a prophet, walked beside the work of God, and stood close to holiness. But this is also the story of a man who let pride whisper louder than obedience and who traded a holy calling for a handful of silver. Because the truth is clear. You can serve in spiritual places and still lose sight of the one you serve. Don't use spiritual positions for selfish gain. The morning sun rolled gently over the hills of Shunammite, casting soft gold over the wheat fields below. A cool breeze tugged at the edges of Gehazi's tunic as he adjusted the saddlebag on the donkey's side. The valley was still waking up, just birds, insects, and the distant rustle of trees. But Gehazi's heart was already busy. He checked the clay jar of oil, uncracked. The bread, still warm. The staff, wrapped and tucked beneath the cloth bundles. All was in order. Still, he frowned. From where he stood, Gehazi could see the edge of the woman's home up on the hillside. The Shunammite woman who had built a room just for Elisha. A woman of wealth, influence. The kind of person who didn't wait in lines or get ignored at temple gates. He shifted his feet and muttered, "She honors Elisha like a king. I carry the baskets and she barely looks at me." Behind him, footsteps approached, measured and calm. "Elisha's ready," said a voice. Gehazi turned. The prophet stood barefoot, robes dusted with travel, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't speak like most men. He didn't command. He didn't bark orders. He simply looked. And when Elisha looked at you, it felt like he saw the part of you you hadn't even admitted to yourself. "Come," he said. "It's time." They walked the path in silence, climbing toward the house. Gehazi carried the food. Elisha carried nothing. As they reached the door, the Shunammite woman met them with a gracious bow. "I've prepared the upper room," she said, "and water." Elisha smiled. "May the Lord bless this home." As they stepped inside, Gehazi's eyes scanned the room. Fresh linens, a clean mat, a small table with a lamp, clay, hand-painted. It was simple, but fine. Gehazi's own home had no lamp, no upper floor, no cushion for guests. Later, as the sun dipped low and evening crept in, Elisha pulled Gehazi aside. "She has given much," the prophet said quietly. "Ask her what she lacks." Gehazi nodded. "Yes, master." He found her near the well, drawing water. "My master wishes to know," he said, voice even, "what you need." "Is there a request you would make? Shall he speak to the king on your behalf?" She laughed gently. "I have a home among my own people," she said. "I need nothing." But as she walked away, something in her eyes lingered. Gehazi returned to Elisha. "She says she needs nothing," he reported. Elisha turned toward the window, quiet for a moment. "She has no son," he said, "and her husband is old." Gehazi raised his eyebrows. "You will bless her?" "I will speak what the Lord gives me," Elisha said, "and next year she will hold a son." That night, Gehazi lay awake on the floor near the doorway, staring at the wooden beams above. A woman with a new room and a future child. A prophet who needed no wealth yet was honored wherever he went. And he, still a servant, still carrying baskets, still sleeping near doorways. Something settled in his chest that night, not bitterness, not yet, but a quiet thought. When will I receive something for all I do? And in that small thought, something dangerous began to grow. The boy arrived just as Elisha said he would. 1 year later, almost to the day, Gehazi saw the Shunammite woman standing in the same doorway, this time with a wide smile and a baby in her arms. The child had thick black hair and lungs as loud as a ram's horn. When Elisha approached, she bent low and whispered, "You were right." Elisha only nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Gehazi watched from a few paces back, holding a clay jug of water. He should have been amazed. He should have been grateful. But something inside him tugged, sharp and silent. The Lord gives children to women with wealth, to people with rooms upstairs, but I carry their water and sleep on dirt floors. He looked down at the jug in his hands, then back at the child. As the years passed, they often returned to that house in Shunem. The woman always greeted Elisha with warm bread and fresh oil. The child, now walking, talking, laughing, grew taller with every visit. Gehazi remained in the background, carrying bags, preparing mats, fetching sandals. One afternoon, Elisha rested beneath the almond tree near the garden wall. Gehazi stood nearby, brushing dust from his sleeves. The boy, now perhaps 10, ran past them with a shepherd's sling in one hand and a wild grin on his face. Gehazi stepped out of the way as the boy sped past. "Slow down before you trip." Elisha chuckled. "You sound like an old man." "I feel like one," Gehazi muttered. Elisha looked up at him. "You feel left behind." The words landed like stones. Gehazi forced a laugh. "I feel tired, that's all." But Elisha didn't smile back. He just looked deeply, knowingly, the way prophets do. Later that evening, while washing travel dust from his hands, Gehazi stared into the basin and asked quietly, "How is it that miracles find everyone else?" A voice behind him said, "You've seen more than most ever will." He turned. Elisha, always silent in his footsteps. Gehazi bowed his head. "I'm grateful, Master." But Elisha didn't nod or walk away. He said gently, "Be careful, Gehazi. It's possible to carry holy things with greedy hands." That night, those words echoed louder than the crickets in the grass. The next morning, everything changed. The boy, healthy just hours before, collapsed in the field beside his father. His head hurt, they said. He cried out. Then he fell still. By the time the servant brought him inside, the mother knew. He was gone. She didn't wail. She didn't faint. She laid him gently on the prophet's bed in the upper room, closed the door, and saddled a donkey. And without telling anyone why, she rode toward Mount Carmel, where Elisha waited, and Gehazi followed again. As she approached from a distance, Elisha rose. "That's the Shunammite woman," he said, "but something's wrong." "Shall I run to her?" Gehazi asked. "Go, ask if all is well." Gehazi sprinted down the path. When he reached her, he bowed low. "Is it well with you? With your husband? With your child?" She looked past him, straight to Elisha, and said, "It is well." Gehazi turned, confused, and jogged back. She said all is well. Elisha narrowed his eyes. "The Lord has hidden it from me." And when she arrived, she fell at his feet, clutched his ankles, and wept. Only then did she say the words that broke the silence. "Did I ask for a son? Didn't I say, 'Don't give me false hope'?" Elisha's face hardened. "Gehazi!" he said, turning quickly. "Take my staff. Go ahead of us. Don't stop. Don't greet anyone. Lay the staff on the boy's face." Gehazi's heart beat fast. Finally! He wasn't just carrying bags now. He was carrying power. He snatched the staff, tucked it under his arm, and ran. As he sped toward the house, one thought pounded in his head. This is my moment. Gehazi ran harder than he ever had in his life. Dust flew behind him. His sandals pounded the ground, heart thudding like war drums in his chest. Elisha's staff bounced against his arm with every stride. People stepped aside on the road as he passed, recognizing the blue servant's robe, the staff in his hand, the urgency in his eyes. This is it, he thought. This is the day they'll remember my name. He reached the house by nightfall. The door was already open. The servant stepped back as he entered, silent, pale-faced. Gehazi pushed through without a word and climbed the stairs to the upper room. There, on the prophet's mat, lay the boy, still, pale, unmoving. No breath, no twitch, not even a flicker of a dream left behind. Gehazi swallowed hard. He stepped closer and unwrapped the staff. His hands trembled slightly. He remembered the way Elisha had touched the sick. He remembered the miracles, the calm, the power. Just do what he does, Gehazi told himself. Just lay it down. He placed the staff gently across the boy's face and waited, and waited, and waited. Nothing. No breath. No heat. No sound. Just silence and failure. Gehazi stepped back. Sweat rolled down his temple. He whispered, "No. No. 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 This should have worked." He tried again, laying the staff across the boy's chest. He whispered a half-formed prayer. Nothing. He leaned close, as if a whisper might stir the dead. Still. Nothing. He stumbled down the stairs and out of the house, his throat tight, his thoughts louder than the wind. What did I do wrong? Why didn't it work? Was it me? Was it never the staff? When Elisha arrived with the mother at his side, Gehazi met them at the gate. "I did what you said," he said quickly. "I laid the staff on the boy, just like you showed me." Elisha didn't scold him. He didn't shout. But his face grew tight, and for the first time, Gehazi noticed something strange in the prophet's eyes. A flicker of grief, and something else. Disappointment. They climbed the stairs in silence. Elisha closed the door behind him, alone. Gehazi waited outside. 1 hour. Then 2. He heard nothing. No footsteps. No voice, no breath, until suddenly a sneeze, then another, then 7. The door opened, and the boy came out alive, blinking, walking, holding Elisha's hand. The Shunammite woman fell to her knees in thanks. Gehazi stepped back, invisible once again. That night, Gehazi sat alone by the water jars, staring at the staff in his lap. It was just wood now. Just a walking stick. But earlier that day, he'd thought it was power, and somewhere inside him something cracked. A whisper curled up from the shadows of his heart. You'll never be more than his shadow. Unless the chariots thundered into Israel like a storm. Naaman, commander of the army of Aram, had arrived. His armor gleamed under the sun. His soldiers rode with spears at their backs and pride in their eyes. The earth trembled with every hoofbeat. But Naaman wasn't there to conquer. He was there to be healed. Gehazi watched from behind Elisha's tent flap, peering out like a child watching lions circle the camp. "Is it true?" he whispered. "That man's won every battle he's ever fought?" Elisha nodded, sitting calmly as he ground dried figs in a bowl. "And he's a leper?" Gehazi asked. Elisha didn't answer. He simply said, "Go tell him to wash in the Jordan 7 times, and he'll be clean." Gehazi blinked. "You're not going to greet him?" "No." "You're not going to pray over him?" "No." "But he's Naaman. He brought wagons of treasure." "He brought pride," Elisha said, "and I won't meet pride with ceremony." When Gehazi gave the message, Naaman's face turned red beneath the faded patches of his skin. "You want me to wash in your muddy river?" he snapped. "We have better waters in Damascus." He spun on his heel, but before the dust could settle, one of his own servants whispered to him, "If the prophet had asked you to do something great and heroic, wouldn't you have done it? What's so hard about bathing?" Naaman stopped, stared at the Jordan in the distance, and turned back. Gehazi followed at a distance as the commander waded into the water once, twice, 3 times. By the 6th dip, the soldiers were whispering. By the 7th, Naaman disappeared beneath the surface, and when he rose, his skin was clean, not just healed, new. Naaman fell to his knees right there in the water. When he returned to the camp, he came straight to Elisha's tent with gold, silver, and garments fit for a king. "This is for you," he said, "a gift for the healing." Elisha shook his head. "As surely as the Lord lives, I will accept nothing." Naaman tried again. Elisha refused again. The commander looked confused, but not offended. He bowed, thanked him, and turned to leave. But Gehazi couldn't stop staring at the treasure, chests of coins, silks from Damascus, gold rings that shimmered even in the shade. He didn't hear Elisha's final blessing. He didn't see Naaman's chariot fade into the hills. All he saw was what they could have had. That night, as the stars flickered above the prophet's camp, Gehazi lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. His fingers clenched the corner of his sleeping mat. "Why send him away with it all?" he whispered. "We serve God every day. Is it wrong to receive something in return?" A voice answered, not Elisha's, not God's, his own. "You carried the staff. You walked the road. You've done your time. Take what you've earned." And in that quiet, dangerous hour, Gehazi rose to his feet. The night air was cool. The path was clear. And Naaman hadn't gone far. The moon hung low over the hills of Samaria, casting silver light across the rocks like a trail meant for shadows. Gehazi moved fast. His sandals skimmed the earth. His heart pounded in his ears, but it wasn't fear pushing him. It was purpose. He had already rehearsed what he would say. He would make it sound holy, make it sound like ministry, and he would take only a little, just enough to feel seen. "It's not greed," he told himself. "It's fairness." In the distance, torchlight flickered. Naaman's caravan. The clinking of armor and creak of wooden wheels guided him closer. When the commander spotted the figure running toward them, he called for the chariot to stop. Gehazi bowed low as he approached, panting for breath. Naaman climbed down from his seat. "Is everything well?" "Yes, yes," Gehazi said quickly, brushing the dust from his robe. "My master sent me after you." Naaman raised an eyebrow. "Elisha." He's just received guests, 2 young prophets from the hill country of Ephraim. He paused for effect. They came with nothing. My master wondered, could you spare a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothes for them? Naaman smiled, relieved. By all means, take 2 talents. He clapped his hands. 2 servants brought out the silver, tied tightly in 2 heavy bags, and fine garments folded with care. Naaman bowed again. Tell your master I'm grateful to serve the Lord of Israel. Gehazi nodded, avoiding his eyes. As the caravan moved on, Gehazi stood in the dust with 2 bags at his feet and silk in his arms. His mind was loud, his heart oddly quiet. There was no thunder, no guilt, just silence. He carried the silver back along a side path, avoiding the road, slipping through gullies and brush like a thief, though he still told himself he wasn't stealing. He buried the silver and clothes in a small cave just outside the village, then dusted his hands off and walked back into camp. Elisha sat where he always did, beneath the shade of the tamarisk tree, head bowed, fingers tracing the edge of his staff. He didn't look up when Gehazi approached. Where have you been? Elisha asked softly. Gehazi froze, a breath caught in his chest. He forced a smile. Your servant didn't go anywhere, he said lightly. Elisha lifted his head, and in his eyes there was no anger, only sorrow. Did not my spirit go with you, he said, when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Gehazi felt the blood drain from his face. You think this is the time to take silver? Elisha whispered. To collect clothes, olive groves, vineyards, servants? Each word sliced deeper than the last. I didn't... Gehazi started. Elisha stood. The leprosy that clung to Naaman will now cling to you and to your descendants after you. The wind died. Even the birds stopped. Gehazi's legs trembled beneath him. He looked down at his hands and saw the first white patch spread across his fingers. The sky was still blue when they told him to leave. That almost made it worse. If it had been storming, if thunder had cracked and fire had fallen, Gehazi might have convinced himself this was only temporary. But instead, the weather was kind, and the world went on turning. 2 young men packed up his things quietly, a thin blanket, a water skin, a staff that was no longer Elisha's, no longer holy. Gehazi didn't speak, neither did they. By midday, he had crossed the boundary stone, the one that marked where clean ended and unclean began. Elisha watched from a distance, face unreadable, not angry, just heavy, weighted, wounded. Gehazi didn't beg, he didn't cry. But when he reached the outer ridge, when the familiar trees of the camp gave way to dry brush and wind-swept rock, he finally allowed himself to sit. And he whispered, I'm still me. But he wasn't. Not anymore. He tried to build a fire that night. His hands shook. The white patches were growing. Small cracks formed near his knuckles. His fingers burned in the cold, but he couldn't feel it fully. It was a strange thing, he thought, to be losing your body from the outside in. The next morning, no one came. No visitors, no letters, no message from Elisha, only wind and silence, and that awful memory of silver in his hands. He wandered a few miles north, found an old watchtower long abandoned. There, among lizards and the bones of old sheep, he made a home of sorts. Food came slowly, water even slower. But the worst part wasn't the hunger. It was the voice in his head. If Elisha had just taken the gift? If I had just asked instead of lied? If I had waited, maybe God would have rewarded me eventually. But none of it mattered now. The choice had been made. Days blurred into weeks. No one spoke his name anymore, not even in warning, not even in prayer. Until one night, many weeks later, he heard footsteps on the gravel outside the tower. He grabbed his walking stick and crouched low. Someone was coming. A single figure, alone, wrapped in dark robes, walking with purpose. Gehazi's heart thudded. No one ever came this far unless they were lost or sent. The figure stopped just outside, then said, in a voice that sent shivers down his spine, "Did you think God was done with you just because you were done with yourself?" Gehazi stepped into the doorway. His legs trembled. His voice cracked. Who are you?" The man stepped forward, face hidden in shadow. "You served a prophet." "I betrayed him." "You saw miracles." "I ruined them." "No," the man said. "You ruined yourself, but not God's plan." Gehazi stared. Was this a dream? A stranger? A messenger? Or something else? But the figure turned and walked away, leaving nothing behind but words, and a seed of something Gehazi hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. By the time Gehazi reached the edge of Samaria, the city was dying. Not from war alone, but from hunger. The Aramean army had laid siege for weeks. No food could enter. No one could leave. And inside the city walls, desperation had turned deadly. Gehazi didn't see the inside. He wasn't allowed in. No one wanted a leper walking through narrow streets during a famine, so he stayed near the broken orchard outside the east wall, what used to be a place for harvesting olives. Now it was just dry roots and old tools scattered like bones. 3 other men joined him there, silent, rough, covered in rags like him. None of them asked names. You don't need a name when everyone calls you unclean. You're not a man anymore. You're a warning. One morning, the wind changed. It carried the smell of meat, burned, bitter, not right. One of the others muttered, "They're eating what's left, even the things no one should eat." Another said, "Even the king can't fix it now." Gehazi pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. He looked out at the distant hills where the enemy campfires flickered. And then he laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh, just a short, sharp sound. The others looked at him. "What's so funny?" Gehazi shook his head. "I served a prophet who multiplied bread." They scoffed. "Then where is he now?" Gehazi didn't answer, because he didn't know. That night, as they sat around a weak fire made of dried roots, one of the men stood. "I'm going to the Aramean camp." The others turned sharply. "They'll kill you." He shrugged. "So will this place. If we stay here, we die. If we go to them, maybe they kill us, or maybe they feed us." Gehazi blinked. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like a decision forming. "Then we all go," he said, "together." Under cover of night, the 4 of them limped and hobbled toward the hills, toward the enemy. No weapons, no hope, just hunger, and the faintest flicker of courage. They reached the edge of the Aramean camp just before dawn, and found nothing. No guards, no soldiers, no firelight, no sound, only scattered pots, horses still tied, meat left on the fire. One tent flap swung in the wind. Another stood wide open. The Arameans were gone, gone, without a trace. One of the men stepped into a tent and gasped, "Food! Clothes! Silver!" Another tent held grain, stacked in bags. Another, wine, blankets, armor, bread. Gehazi stood in the center of it all, eyes wide, heart thudding. His mind rushed back to another tent, years earlier. Naaman's silver, the lie, the consequence. One of the lepers grabbed silver from a chest and whooped with joy. "Take it all! We're rich!" Another began stuffing bags with food. Gehazi reached for a pouch of coins. His fingers stopped. He looked down at the shining silver. Then he dropped it. "No," he said aloud. "Not this time." The others looked at him, confused. He stood tall, taller than he had in months. "This isn't just for us," he said. "We must tell the city." One man laughed. "They'll kill us before we get close." "Maybe," Gehazi said. "But maybe they remember the God who saves." And for the first time since the day his skin turned white, Gehazi ran toward a city not to hide, but to bring hope. The sun had barely crested the hill when Gehazi and the others reached the eastern wall of Samaria. He could already hear the cries from inside, mothers pleading for bread, merchants begging for mercy, soldiers shouting warnings over half-empty barrels. It smelled like smoke and fear. Gehazi stepped forward and slammed the end of his staff against the city gate. "Open!" he shouted. "We bring news." A pause. Then, "Who speaks?" He straightened. "Gehazi, former servant of the prophet Elisha." Silence. The guards knew that name and that story. Voices murmured behind the gate, footsteps. A wooden hatch slid open with a scrape. One guard peered out, squinting. "You?" "Yes," Gehazi said, "and I bring word that the siege is over." The guard frowned. "You mock us." "I'm telling the truth. There are no soldiers outside. They've fled." "Fled?" the man scoffed. "Aram doesn't flee." "There's food in the tents, enough to feed the city." The guard cursed. "You think because you're dying in the hills we'll believe your lies?" "I've lied before," Gehazi said calmly, "but not now." That, more than anything, made the man pause. Not a protest of innocence, not a speech of pride, just honesty. Eventually, they let him speak to the king's captain. The man rode out halfway to the camp with 2 scouts and came back pale-faced and stunned. "It's true," he muttered to the king. "They're gone. Their supplies are untouched." The king narrowed his eyes. "It's a trap," he said. "They're waiting in the shadows." "Or," Gehazi said, stepping forward, "God drove them away like dust in the wind." The captain glared at him. "You? A leper? You think you understand what God is doing?" Gehazi met his gaze. "Number. But I remember what it feels like when he moves." The king sent messengers, and by evening, the gates of Samaria had opened, and the people flooded out like a wave, tearing through the fields, racing to the tents, shouting, weeping, praising, and feasting. Just as Elisha had once said, by this time tomorrow, flour will sell cheap in the streets of Samaria, and it did. But the captain who mocked Gehazi, he never made it to the food. He was trampled at the gate by the rush of people, left broken on the stones, never tasting the salvation he doubted. Gehazi stood on a distant hill, wrapped in rags, watching the city rejoice. No one clapped for him. No one called his name. But this time, he didn't need it. Because the same mouth that once lied for silver had now spoken truth to save a city. And somewhere in the wind he thought he heard a whisper, not of judgment, but of mercy. You are still part of the story. It had been days since the siege broke. Samaria was loud again, full of trade, laughter, even music. But Gehazi didn't go back inside. He stayed on the outskirts, near the rocks where the lepers gathered. The food was better. The skies were clear. But peace, that was still far off. Because you can be fed and still feel empty. He watched from a distance as children danced near the well, their stomachs finally full. He saw the woman from the market who once refused him water, now smiling, tossing dates to the crowd. He even heard someone shouting praises to God, thanking him for that mysterious messenger who brought the news. But no one knew it was him. Or maybe they did, and just didn't want to say it. That night, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Gehazi wandered further from the city, just to feel silence again. That's when he saw the figure ahead, standing by the almond tree near the ridge. A tall man, still, robed in gray. Gehazi's breath caught. He knew that posture, that silhouette. Elisha! The prophet didn't move, just turned slowly, and their eyes met for the first time in years. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind brushed between them like a curtain being drawn back. Gehazi lowered his head. I thought I'd never see you again. Elisha nodded once. You thought correctly. Gehazi stepped closer, slowly, his steps uneven, his heart unsteady. I never asked for your forgiveness, he said. I never offered it, Elisha replied. The words landed heavy, but not harsh, just real. Gehazi looked up, eyes rimmed with weariness. I spoke truth, master, about the army, about the food, and the people lived. I heard, Elisha said, and still I carry the curse. Elisha's gaze softened. Gehazi, what you carry now is not the curse. It's the consequence. Gehazi looked away. What's the difference? The curse separates you from God. Consequence reminds you why you need Him. Silence again. But this time it felt less like punishment, more like mercy. Elisha reached into his satchel and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Gehazi. It was a loaf of bread, still warm, still whole. Gehazi stared at it like it was a scroll from heaven. Why? He asked. Elisha looked at him, firm, kind, unflinching. Because I never stopped loving you. The words hit harder than the judgment ever had. Gehazi sat down right there in the dust, holding the bread like a lifeline. He didn't say thank you. He didn't know how. But tears did what words couldn't. That night, they sat under the stars, not master and servant, not prophet and leper, just two men who had both carried the weight of obedience and disobedience. And for the first time in a long time, Gehazi didn't feel forgotten. It started with a whisper, a palace official, a closed-door conversation, a strange request. And by mid-morning, Gehazi found himself summoned, yes, summoned, to the king's court. He thought it was a mistake. I'm a leper, he said. They won't even let me walk through the city gates. But the guard at his door simply said, the king asked for you. And so, Wrapped in his oldest robe, walking with a staff and slow steps, Gehazi entered through a servant's passage and was led into the royal courtyard. It was grander than he remembered. He hadn't seen it since the early days when he stood just behind Elisha during meetings with kings, pretending not to listen but hearing everything. Now, the guards kept their distance from him, and when he entered the hall, people turned, but the king, he smiled. "Are you the one who served the prophet Elisha?" Gehazi bowed. "I was." "I've heard stories," the king said, waving a servant to bring water. "They say you saw the dead raised, the sick healed, even food multiply." Gehazi hesitated. "I did." The king leaned forward. Tell me about the boy from Shunem, the one who died and lived again." And so Gehazi spoke, carefully at first, but then with detail, with emotion, with memory too heavy to stay locked away. He told of the prophet's upper room, of the mother's silent faith, of the rush to the hilltop, of laying the staff and failing, of Elisha shutting the door behind him, of the 7 sneezes and the boy's laughter. By the end, the king was leaning forward in awe. Even the guards looked stunned. "You saw this?" the king asked. "I was there," Gehazi said. "And still," the king said softly, "you walk in exile." Gehazi didn't answer. He didn't need to. At that moment, a new figure entered the court, a woman in fine but weather-worn clothes. Her hair was graying at the edges, her robes faded by years of sun and grief. She bowed low. The king blinked. "Who are you?" She looked up. "I am the woman of Shunem." Gehazi's breath caught. "She left the land during the famine," one advisor whispered. "Now she's returned, asking for her home back." The king turned to Gehazi. "Is this the boy's mother?" Gehazi nodded slowly. "Yes, your majesty. The one who built the prophet a room, the one whose son lived again." The king looked back at the woman, his voice gentle. "Then your land is yours once more, with everything that was taken." She covered her face and wept. "And Gehazi?" He stood beside her, stunned, because a story he had long tried to bury had just become the bridge to someone else's restoration. He hadn't healed her son. He hadn't even believed fully at the time, but he had been there. And now, by telling the truth, not for gain, but for glory, he had helped restore what had been lost. As he walked out of the palace, no guards followed. No coins were handed to him, no robes laid across his shoulders, but Gehazi didn't want them. Because this time, he hadn't taken anything, and somehow that felt more valuable than silver. Gehazi sat beneath a figless fig tree on the southern ridge. No leaves, just twisted limbs stretching into the wind. He liked this one. It never pretended to be what it wasn't. Below him, the plain spread out in golden stripes, wheat fields returning now that peace had found its way back into Samaria. The famine was over. The siege had lifted. The people were planting again. And him? He wasn't Elisha's servant anymore. He wasn't the leper anymore either. Not in people's eyes. He was just Gehazi. Strange how the most painful identity was also the most honest. But he'd learned something in the silence of exile, in the rejection, in the ache of being remembered for his worst moment. He'd learned that God doesn't always remove the consequence, but sometimes he rewrites what it means. He still bore the marks on his skin. He still slept outside the city, but now people came to him. Not many. Just a few. A mother with a sick daughter. A merchant whose son was asking questions about prophets and promises. A young widow who brought bread and stayed long enough to ask, "What was he like?" The prophet. And Gehazi told them. All of it. The miracles, the mercy, the warnings, the voice that spoke without thunder but always carried weight. He didn't pretend to be holy anymore. He just told the truth. One day, a traveler came through the orchard paths, a boy barely old enough to shave, with a scroll tied across his back and nervous energy in his steps. "Are you the one who saw the staff laid on the dead child?" Gehazi nodded. "Are you the one who lied to the prophet?" He nodded again. The boy sat, awkward, quiet, then asked, "Did God ever stop using you after that?" Gehazi looked down at his hands, still spotted, still weak, but able. "No," he said softly, "but he used me differently." The boy looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," Gehazi said, "sometimes God speaks through a prophet, and sometimes he speaks through someone who messed up and didn't stay down." The boy sat with him until sundown, asking question after question, and Gehazi answered every one, not like a teacher, not like a prophet, but like a man who had been broken and forgiven and still breathing. He had once run for silver. Now he didn't run at all, but somehow people came anyway. Because sometimes what the world throws away becomes the stone God builds on. The old staff still leaned beside Gehazi's door. He didn't use it much anymore, but he never threw it away. It wasn't a relic of shame now. It was a reminder of how close he came to missing everything and how close God still stayed. The sun was low. Golden light spread across the hills like warm honey. The sound of distant laughter rose from the vineyards. Children picking grapes, someone singing. It was harvest season, not just for the land, but for him. Gehazi sat on a stone just outside the orchard, his usual spot, and watched the fields with quiet eyes. He had nothing left to prove, no reputation to protect, no pulpit to stand on. Just a voice, a memory, and a story worth telling. A young man approached from the path below, another visitor. He'd been coming every few days now. He brought others sometimes, curious ones, not to see a prophet, not to hear a sermon, just to listen. The man sat beside Gehazi and asked softly, "Do you regret it? The lie? The silver? The leprosy?" Gehazi didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, still marked, then at the staff, then at the sun setting behind the hills. "I regret the greed," he said. "The ambition, the pride." A pause. "But I don't regret the lesson." The man furrowed his brow. "What lesson?" "That you can be close to miracles," Gehazi said, "and still miss the heart of God." The man nodded slowly, then smiled. "You know," he said, "I heard someone say the prophets are gone now, that God doesn't speak like he used to." Gehazi looked out over the fields. "He still speaks," he said. "How do you know?" "Because you're here," Gehazi said, "and I'm still breathing." The young man laughed. Gehazi didn't. He just smiled. As the last light faded, Gehazi leaned back against the tree trunk. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, in a long time, he didn't feel like a servant who had fallen. He felt like a man who had been forgiven, and though his name might never be sung in songs, and though his robes were never restored, And though he bore the marks of a mistake, he was still in the story, still used, still known, still loved, and that was more than enough. And though he bore the marks of a mistake, he was still in the story, still used, still known, still loved, and that was more than enough.